When people say that the Federal Reserve is controlled by unaccountable groups of rich people, they're absolutely right, and we need to use legislation to make those unaccountable groups of people more accountable, or what have you. But if the Federal Reserve was completely done away with, our currency, our world economy, our national economy, and all of the choices would still be controlled by a completely unaccountable group of rich people. It would just be a different group of rich people that had no connection to the democratic process in the United States. So I want to talk about the Federal Reserve briefly, and this is sort of a bit of a libertarian hangover for me. There are figures, especially over the past 7 months, in the Republican Party, in that orbit, that are sort of more libertarian leaning, who have reminded me why I used to like them so much, why I used to like libertarian-oriented politics so much, why I used to like the sort of libertarian wing of the Republican Party so much. These are figures like Justin Amash and Thomas Massie and Rand Paul. These are guys who have all been very, very Trumpy, which I do not like, but it's kind of extraordinary how they've been willing to buck the mainstream on really important issues. I was first attracted to the libertarian side of things in the first decade of this century because they seem to be the only people who talked with any seriousness about U.S. criminal justice and how bad over-policing was. Long before Ferguson, long before it became sort of a cause célèbre in more progressive, more leftist circles, more democratic circles. And they were always for a more restrained foreign policy. After Obama became in charge of the war on terror, they were the only people left who were against aggressive U.S. foreign policy. So I always found that very attractive. But I was always like a little mystified by this obsession with the Federal Reserve. I really did not understand the Federal Reserve, what it did and how it worked back then, but I had already had a sense of just how it was this incredibly complex and important thing, and sort of Ron Paul's insistence that we need to end the Fed. If we just get rid of it, everything will be better, never made much sense to me. Well, it's now a couple decades later. I have read many books on the Federal Reserve. I have watched it operate for 20 years and watched it operate through a couple crises. And I think I can say with great confidence that I still do not understand the Federal Reserve. But I have come to a conclusion that the whole end the Fed, abolish the Fed, let's just end the Federal Reserve, this is the central bank of the United States, is an insane policy proposal. I think my hunch when I was in my 20s and interested in libertarianism is confirmed by what I have learned since. So Thomas Massie is definitely a Trumpy guy. He's a psycho, but he's really, really impressed me over the past couple months by being not just the only Republican, but honestly, one of the only Republicans and Democrats who has spoken out about how insane a number of these laws, attempted laws, bills that the House of Representatives have passed related to Israel are. Things about the anti-Semitism resolution or attempted law. I call these attempted laws. This is not a legal definition by any terms, but because they are unlikely to make it through the Senate and get signed. These resolutions talking about how actually criticizing Netanyahu is anti-Semitism, or the Republicans actually, and a number of Democrats this past week passed this insane thing talking about how we're going to defund the U.S. military if a U.S. president attempts to send Israel any fewer weapons than it asks for, something along those lines. But anyway, so Massie has impressed me with that, and thankfully, lest I become at all interested in libertarian politics again, he's decided to use his moment of notoriety to push an end the Fed bill, and I the more that I read about the Federal Reserve, and at this point I've read a number of books, it's a focus of this book that I'm writing, American Empire, the First 100 Years. It's actually kind of one of the two key things that happened in the 1910s that established U.S. empire. I would say would be in 1917, the British basically running out of money to fight World War I, and the U.S. government stepping in to help them finish World War I. And in part, one of the reasons we were able to do that was because the United States finally decided to establish a central bank in 1913. That's when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. So I've learned more and more about the Federal Reserve in recent years. And the more that I learn about it, and honestly, the more humble I get, the more I'm like, you know what, like, obviously we need a central bank in the United States, but I don't know, man, like, it's so complicated, and there's definitely so many things that are wrong about it. Unquestionably, critiques saying that who's this unelected group of incredibly rich people that make all the decisions for the US and the world's economy? 100% valid critiques. So I was like, okay, Thomas Massie, what do you have to say? And I looked into his abolish the Fed thing, and this is Thomas Massie had this abolish the Fed thing, and then Justin Amash, who is he's a Michigan guy, he's a Libertarian guy, he's a Palestinian guy actually, who's also been really great on the Israeli attack on Palestine, retweeted it. So like these are all these Libertarian guys who are like, yeah, end the Fed. And I went and I looked, I read, it was pretty easy. I read the entire proposed bill. It's rare that I'll sit down and read an entire piece of proposed U.S. legislation, but this was really easy because it's 4 pages long. That's Thomas Massie's End the Fed proposal, essentially saying, well, what was the Federal Reserve will just get absorbed by the Treasury Department. It just essentially no thought was put into this. It's like that archetypal experience of Obamacare, Republicans being like, yeah, screw Obamacare, get rid of it, and they just had no actual answer. And that strikes me as just so insanely irresponsible. I am not like a huge advocate for the way that the Federal Reserve works right now. I think there's a lot of ways that the Federal Reserve works, a lot of intricacies of the Federal Reserve Act, as I learn more and more, that seem kind of insane. Like, why do we don't need all these regional Fed boards. We don't need, it's incredibly convoluted. It doesn't make a ton of sense. But the idea that we could just sort of sweep away the U.S. central bank is insane. It's something that we tried in the 1830s. The United States had, I guess it was the second bank of the United States that Andrew Jackson successfully killed in the 1830s, and it instantly led to a financial crisis. And between the 1830s and the 1860s, the United States didn't have a central bank, didn't even have unified currency. That wouldn't happen today because the Treasury Department, I believe, is responsible for sort of minting the currency or whatnot. But without the Federal Reserve there, what that currency would mean, what interest rates would be, it would all be completely up in the air. So anyway, in the 1830s, getting rid of our central bank led to economic collapse and crisis. But in the 1830s, the United States was still kind of a backwater without too much economic significance for the rest of the world. The United States today, and the Federal Reserve specifically, is the foundation of the economic and financial architecture of the entire world. Like, that's what your retirement savings are based on. That's what the continued viability of any of our investments are based on. And it's just a real indication of the complete irresponsibility and blindness of the libertarian approach to things, that you could seriously propose, yeah, abolish it. Let's just get rid of the Fed. Just take it all away. The Fed is the entity that certainly possibly making bad decisions that were oriented towards helping rich people more than the most people, but it is the entity that saved the world economy in 2008 and the entity that saved the world economy in 2020. And we're just going to get rid of it entirely. It's quite insane. And I don't usually like to put this in such jingoistic terms, but it's also this is something that I've learned recently. It's like before we had a central bank, in that interim between the 1830s and 1913, we essentially just let London do our central banking for us. If we don't have a central bank, if we're not occupying the position at the center of the world's financial life, somebody else will. After a cataclysmic depression brought about by abolishing the Fed, then the People's Bank of China would perhaps step in, or perhaps it would be a collaboration between the People's Bank of China and the European Central Bank. So it's just it's so infantile and so incorrect. By all means, mend the Fed, audit the Fed. These are good ideas. Reform the Fed. I think you can make a pretty good case that perhaps, but I'm not sure it's a great case, but I think you can make a case that the Federal Reserve is too independent from elected officials now. I think that's an interesting idea that I'd like to hear more about. But just the idea that with a 4-page bill, you could just get rid of the Federal Reserve and see anything other than one of the most horrific financial crises the world has endured for a century is it's just ending the Fed. It's a bad idea. So anyway, sorry if that was a long riff. I'm probably going to cut that out and publish that as a unproduced video next week. The Federal Reserve does the best it can with rich people not paying much of anything in taxes. I think that's true. And I think the key thing is when people say that the Federal Reserve is controlled by unaccountable groups of rich people, they're absolutely right. And we need to use legislation to make those unaccountable groups of people more accountable or what have you. But if the Federal Reserve was completely done away with, our currency, our world economy, our national economy, and all of the choices would still be controlled by a completely unaccountable group of rich people. It would just be a different group of rich people that had no connection to the democratic process in the United States. So yeah, unfortunately, as long as we continue under any system, not just capitalism, you're probably going to have money and the economy and currency controlled by an unaccountable group of privileged people. That was also the case in the Soviet Union. It's certainly the case in China. And it's certainly the case in North Korea, and it's certainly the case in Cuba. There is yet to be a system that provides an alternative to this. So I think, and what would happen, as we've seen with many, many, many libertarian policies, is just the sort of sitting back and be like, getting government out of this just means that somebody else controls it, and they control it for their benefit. I think Justin Amash made this very, very clear by also tweeting about Bitcoin in relation to this end the Fed business. So yeah, it's not despite their great ideas on foreign policy and criminal justice, libertarians are not serious people. Scott Locke says elected people should never control the Fed or monetary policy. Look at Argentina. Maybe. Federal Reserve officers are amongst the best educated people in the country. I mean, it's really hard. Adam Tooze does some great work just talking about how the Federal Reserve essentially saved the world in 2008 and 2020. These are people who have a sense of what they're doing, but I think it is very true that we are over-reliant on the resources of the Federal Reserve, both economic and educational, and we should probably work harder to have economies that are fundamentally stronger than just sort of relying on a bunch of eggheads at the Fed to save us during perennial crises. Though the whole point of a central bank, going back to the 19th century when sort of modern central banking kind of got started, is to save us from crises. So even if we abolished the Fed and it didn't lead to instant economic crisis, we would get to a point where there would inevitably be another inevitable crisis. And would China benefit from the U.S. destroying its Fed, and would it benefit from the death of the U.S. dollar? That's a $1 trillion question, Logan. I don't know. I would lean towards probably not. The Chinese, I'm not going full Zion here, but the Chinese have really, 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 really benefited from U.S. economic hegemony. And if they felt obligated to step in as central bankers, as the world's number one currency, with all the exorbitant privileges and exorbitant duties that entails, I'm not sure the Chinese would be too happy about it. I think they'd probably be happy to try, and perhaps they'd succeed. Who knows? But I think it would be a very risky situation for the Chinese government, and I don't think they like risky situations. So perhaps they'd be willing to rise to the occasion, but I don't think they'd really seek it out. Famously, Russia has been trying to set up this let's do a tax on the dollar since 2014 or so. Let's undermine the U.S. dollar, and China has really not been that interested because they own a lot of U.S. dollars and don't want those to be devalued. I think Russia sold off all its dollars in the assumption that this was going to be a big blow against the United States, and nobody really noticed.